The phone rested on the polished surface of my oak desk, a sleek black rectangle in a wedge of late afternoon sun. It seemed harmless enough, a simple device of glass and metal, but in that moment it felt like a shard of ice pressed against my heart. I had been sitting there for perhaps 10 minutes, the silence of the house a living thing, expanding to fill the spaces where my wife Caroline's laughter used to be. I read the message for the 10th time, though the words had burned themselves into my memory on the first pass. My chest felt tight, a dull, heavy ache that made each breath a conscious effort. The room, which had always been a sanctuary of warmth and memories, suddenly felt cold, its walls closing in. It was a simple text from my daughter Jessica, but it was constructed with a casual cruelty that felt like a physical blow. It read, "Dad, we need to talk about Italy. Darian and I have decided it's best if this is a family-only trip, just for us and the kids to connect. We'll bring you back some souvenirs. Hope you understand." Souvenirs. They would bring me back a cheap trinket to replace a shared memory. But it was the two words, family only, that did the real damage. With a simple phrase, they had drawn a circle, and I was on the outside. After everything I had done, after everything I had given, I was no longer considered family. The words were a verdict delivered without a trial, and the sentence was exile. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt like a roar. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow, counting down the seconds of a life that suddenly felt profoundly, terribly alone. My mind drifted back 6 months to a cheerful Sunday dinner. The air was filled with the aroma of roasted chicken and Jessica's excited chatter. She had spread travel brochures across the dining table, her eyes shining with a familiar youthful excitement I hadn't seen in years. "Tuscany, Dad. Can you imagine? We could rent a villa. The kids could run through vineyards, and we could see the real David in Florence." Her enthusiasm was infectious. I felt a genuine surge of joy for them, for her. I had leaned forward, tracing the outline of a cypress tree in one of the glossy photos. "Jess, that sounds wonderful," I had said, my voice full of warmth. "Absolutely wonderful." I had spent the next week lost in my own research. I watched travelogues about the Tuscan countryside, imagining the taste of fresh pasta and the warmth of the Italian sun on my face. I pictured myself with my grandkids, Marco and Lily, sharing a gelato in a bustling piazza, telling them stories about their grandmother, about how she had always dreamed of seeing Italy. The dream felt so real, so close. At our next dinner, I had brought it up. "I've been looking into flights," I said carefully. "I can book my own ticket and hotel, of course. I wouldn't want to impose, I just thought it would be lovely to be there with you all." Jessica had started to nod, a smile on her face, but Darian, my son-in-law, had cut her off. He had placed a hand on my shoulder, his smile smooth and practiced the kind he used on his clients. "Don't worry about it, Tom," he said, his voice dripping with false generosity. "We've got it covered." He called me Tom, not Dad. He always did. It was a small thing, a subtle distancing, that I had always tried to ignore. Now, sitting in my silent office, his words echoed in my mind, no longer sounding generous, but like a dismissal. "We've got it covered." What he had meant was, we are in control. He wasn't inviting me along. He was managing a potential obligation. And now that obligation had been deemed unnecessary. The memory, once a source of happy anticipation, had soured into another piece of evidence in a case I hadn't even realized I was building. The text message wasn't an isolated incident. It was the final cracking timber on a structure that had been rotting from the inside for over a year. My thoughts, heavy and slow, drifted back further to the day it all began. The day I handed them the foundation to their new life. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. Jessica and Darian had found their dream house in a pristine gated community. It had everything they wanted: a big yard for the kids, a modern kitchen for entertaining, and the right zip code to impress Darian's clients. It also had a price tag that was just beyond their reach. I remember the phone call from Jessica. Her voice was a careful blend of hope and despair. "We're so close, Dad," she had whispered, "but the bank won't approve the full amount." For 2 weeks, I barely slept. I walked the floors of this house, the house I had shared with Caroline for 40 years. I sat in her favorite armchair and looked at the numbers again and again. My retirement was comfortable but not extravagant. To give them what they needed, I would have to liquidate the nest egg Caroline and I had painstakingly built. It was our security. It was the money for the cruises we never took, the new car I never bought, the safety net for any health crisis that might lie ahead. It was a monument to a lifetime of careful saving and quiet sacrifice. In the end, it wasn't a difficult decision. What is a father for if not to provide? I went to the bank and made the transfer. $285,000. The number still felt unreal. I remember the moment I handed them the cashier's check. Darian had shaken my hand firmly, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant light. Jessica had hugged me, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Daddy," she cried into my shoulder. "You've given us our future." I believed her. I truly believed I was pouring the foundation for their happiness, a solid base on which they could build their lives. I thought I was giving them a home, but now I realized I had only bought a property from which I was now being gently, politely, but firmly excluded. My sacrifice hadn't bought me a place in their family. It had bought them a ticket to a life where I was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Now the smaller slights and omissions from the past year began to line up in my mind like soldiers falling into formation. They weren't random acts of thoughtlessness. They were a pattern. The Sunday dinners I wasn't invited to with the excuse that the kids were just so exhausted. The way my calls would go to voicemail more and more often, returned hours later with a brief perfunctory text. I remembered last Christmas when I had brought over my traditional handwritten gift tags for the presents, a little ritual Caroline had started. Darian had intercepted them at the door with a strained smile. "Thanks, Tom, but we're doing a coordinated silver and gold theme this year. These just wouldn't match." He said it as if he were doing me a favor by pointing out my social misstep. Then there was the incident with Caroline's armchair. It was an old, overstuffed wingback chair, admittedly worn, but it was where she had read to Jessica every night. It was sacred. One day I arrived for a visit to find it gone, replaced by a sleek, sterile leather monstrosity. When I asked, Darian had clapped me on the back. "Had to modernize the place, Tom. That old thing was an eyesore. Don't worry, we donated it to a good cause." They hadn't asked. They had simply erased a piece of her, a piece of me, from the home I had paid for. Each incident had been a small cut, a tiny fissure in the foundation. I had patched them over, telling myself I was being sensitive, that I shouldn't create conflict. But the text message about Italy wasn't a fissure. It was an earthquake shaking the entire structure until the truth was laid bare. I looked across the room at the framed photograph of Caroline on the mantelpiece. Her smile was as warm and reassuring as ever. I asked the silence, "What would you do, Cara?" And as clear as if she were standing beside me, I heard her voice in my memory, strong and unwavering. "Don't let them erase you, Tom. Don't you dare." The pain that had been a dull ache in my chest began to sharpen, to crystallize into something else entirely. It was a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about a missed vacation to Italy. It wasn't about gelato or the Tuscan sun. This was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about the memory of my wife and the value of a lifetime of work and love. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken my generosity for a limitless resource they could tap at will. They had made a fundamental miscalculation. I was not a man given to loud displays of anger. I had spent my life as a forensic accountant, a man who believed in balance sheets and the unyielding logic of numbers. I believed that every action has a consequence, that every debt must eventually be paid. My daughter and her husband had just created a significant imbalance in the ledger of our lives. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up my phone. I didn't navigate to my text messages to write an angry reply. I didn't even open my call history to find Jessica's number. My thumb moved with a calm, deliberate purpose to my contacts, scrolling down to the letter C. I found the name I was looking for: Ben Carter. I pressed the call button and listened to the phone ring once, twice. Ben Carter Law, a crisp voice answered. Ben, it's Tom, I said, my voice even and low. I think it's time we review some paperwork. Ben Carter's office was an island of the past, and I mean that as a compliment. It was on the second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind with a real wooden staircase that groaned with the weight of history. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of old paper and leather wrapped around me like a familiar coat. There were no minimalist glass desks or abstract art on the walls. Instead, there was a heavy mahogany desk scarred with the honorable wounds of decades of work. The walls were lined with books not for decoration, but for reference, their spines cracked and their pages filled with the fine print that governs our lives. Sunlight streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny world of its own. It was a place where things were built to last, a stark contrast to the disposable, trend-obsessed world my daughter and her husband now inhabited. Ben looked up from a stack of papers as I entered. He was a man whose face had settled into a comfortable arrangement of thoughtful lines. He had been my friend for 30 years and my lawyer for 20. More importantly, he had been Carolyn's friend too. He stood, his expression full of genuine concern, and gestured to one of the worn leather chairs opposite his desk. Tom, he said, his voice a low rumble. I got your message. Come in, sit down. You sound like you're carrying the world on your shoulders. I sank into the chair, the leather sighing under my weight. He let the silence sit for a moment, a courtesy few people afford anymore. Then he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. I'm sorry to hear about this mess with Jessica and the vacation. He began, his tone gentle, that of a friend first and a lawyer second. Kids can be thoughtless. They get wrapped up in their own lives. Have you tried talking to her? Really talking without Darian in the room? Sometimes these things are just terrible misunderstandings. I listened, appreciating the kindness behind his words. The old Tom. The Tom from 2 days ago would have agreed. He would have agonized over how to phrase a text message, how to initiate a conversation without causing a scene. He would have blamed himself, wondering what he had done to be treated this way. But that Tom was gone. The pain was still there, a cold, dense star in my chest, but my mind was operating on a different frequency now. I was no longer a father trying to mend a broken connection. I was an auditor who had just found a critical anomaly in the books. I let him finish, and then I slowly shook my head. I reached down beside my chair and lifted the thin accordion file I had brought with me, placing it on his desk. The sound was soft, but in the quiet room it felt definitive, like a gavel striking wood. It's not about feelings anymore, Ben, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I felt in my soul. It's about facts and numbers. Ben's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked from my face to the folder and back again. He saw the shift in me, the hardening of my resolve. I leaned forward, my own hands now flat on the arms of the chair. I need you to look at the structure of the $285,000 I gave them for the house. I want to know exactly what it is legally. Was it a gift and was it a loan? What paperwork did we sign? What paperwork did we fail to sign? I want to know every loophole, every clause, every string that might still be attached. I'm not asking for your advice as a friend right now, Ben. I am retaining your services as my lawyer. I need to know what my options are. I saw the last of his friendly, conciliatory posture fade, replaced by the focused attention of the professional I knew him to be. He understood. This was no longer a family squabble to be mediated over coffee. This was a case. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, pulled the folder towards him, and opened it. The quiet rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of the beginning. With the folder open between us, Ben and I began our work. For the first time in days, the emotional fog in my head began to clear, replaced by the familiar sharp focus of a professional task. It felt like coming home. The initial documents were simple enough. There was the wire transfer confirmation from my bank showing a single transaction of $285,000. There was a brief, almost casual letter Darian had asked me to sign stating that the funds were a gift to aid in the purchase of a family home for Jessica and him. On the surface, it all looked clean, straightforward. Ben adjusted his reading glasses, his expression sympathetic. "Well, Tom," he said softly. On the face of it, Darian was thorough. "This gift letter makes it very difficult to claim the money was a loan." I nodded my eyes not on the letter, but on the wire confirmation slip. Something was nagging at me, a tiny detail that felt out of place. It was the kind of detail most people would overlook, a piece of administrative data. But in my line of work, you learn that the biggest lies are often hidden in the smallest print. "Look at the receiving account, Ben," I said, my finger tapping the paper. "Read the name." Ben leaned in. "Apex Wealth Management," he read aloud. He looked back at me, a question in his eyes. My mind instantly supplied the memory of that conversation. Darian sitting at my kitchen table looking earnest and professional. He had explained it all with such easy confidence. "It's just a smarter way to handle the funds, Tom," he had said, swirling the coffee I had made for him. "Instead of wiring it directly to the escrow company, we'll route it through my firm's primary holding account. It's a simple pass-through. We can let it sit for a few weeks, it generates a bit of interest, and we pay the builder directly from there. It creates a cleaner paper trail for tax purposes and looks better on our financial statements. It's just smart finance." I had trusted him. He was family, and he was a financial advisor. Why would I question his expertise? Now, in the quiet, methodical atmosphere of Ben's office, those words sounded hollow, rehearsed. The first red flag, a flag I had been completely blind to, began to wave in my memory. Ben swiveled in his chair and turned to his computer monitor. "All right," he said, his voice now all business. "Let's follow the money." The feeling was electric, a current of purpose that shot through my fatigue. This I knew how to do. This was my language. Ben pulled up the statements for the Apex Wealth Management, holding account for the period in question. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, my mind automatically processing the flow of debits and credits. We were looking for one thing, a corresponding outflow, a single payment, or a series of large payments to the home builder that would total $285,000. We scrolled through the first week. Nothing. The second week. Nothing. We reached the date the final payment on the house was due. There were plenty of transactions. Payments to high-end architects, transfers to other investment vehicles, debits for what looked like lease payments on luxury European cars. But there was no large payment to the construction company. The money I had given them, my life savings, the legacy I had built with Caroline, had been transferred into that account, and it had never come out. It hadn't been a pass-through. It had been absorbed. It was being used as the firm's operating capital, a slush fund, to pay for Darian's business expenses and lavish lifestyle. The blood drained from my face. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. This was a different kind of cold than the one I felt reading Jessica's text. That was the cold of emotional abandonment. This was the cold, hard certainty of calculated deception. Ben leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, low whistle. "Oh, that clever son of a gun," he murmured, more to himself than to me. Darian hadn't just been an ungrateful son-in-law. He had been a predator. He had looked at me, his wife's father, and seen nothing but a mark. He had used the language of love and family to execute a financial maneuver. The excuse of optimizing cash flow was an elaborate lie a professional courtesy he extended to his victim while picking his pocket. The first red flag was no longer just a flag. It was a declaration of war. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that the fight over a family vacation was over. A much larger, much more dangerous battle had just begun. Back in my own study, surrounded by the quiet hum of my computer, I felt a part of myself awaken that had been dormant for years. The grief and the anger were still there, but they were now channeled, focused into a singular, powerful beam of inquiry. I wasn't just a grieving father anymore. I was a hunter, and the scent of my prey was hidden in the digital ether of financial records. My fingers, which had felt clumsy and old just days ago, now moved across the keyboard with a renewed sense of purpose. I started where any good investigation begins: the public record. All investment firms in the United States are required to file certain disclosures documents that are in theory meant to provide transparency. Most people never look at them. I lived in them for 30 years. I accessed the public portals, my old credentials still active, and began to pull the filings for Apex Wealth Management. The first thing that struck me was the performance Darian was claiming. According to his reports, Apex was delivering consistent double-digit returns quarter after quarter. In a stable, booming market, that would be impressive. In the current economic climate, with its volatility and unpredictable swings, it was nearly impossible. It was like a ship claiming to sail in a straight line through a hurricane. It defied logic. A healthy dose of skepticism had always been my most valuable professional asset. I started to cross-reference Apex's stated holdings with the actual performance of those assets in the open market. A picture began to emerge, blurry at first, then sharpening into a horrifying image of deception. Darian was a master of presentation. His reports were beautiful, filled with optimistic charts and confident projections. But when I peeled back the layers, I found inconsistencies. He was overstating the value of assets, delaying the reporting of losses, and using complex financial instruments to obscure the true health of the firm. He wasn't a financial genius. He was a magician skilled in the art of misdirection. Then I found the key. It was buried in a footnote on a quarterly report from last year, right after my money had been deposited. The report noted a significant capital injection from a private equity partner, which had allowed the firm to expand its portfolio and attract a new tier of clientele. The amount was not specified, but the timing was unmistakable. That private equity partner was me, my $285,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. Darian hadn't just used my money to pay his bills. He had leveraged it. He had presented my life savings to potential new clients as proof of his firm's success and stability. He had used my name, my reputation, my quiet life of hard work as bait. I could see the whole scheme laid out in my mind with perfect, chilling clarity. He would bring in a new investor, let's call him Investor A. He would use the funds from Investor A not to invest, but to pay the promised returns to an earlier investor, Investor B, while skimming a hefty management fee for himself. Then he would find Investor C to pay off Investor A. All the while, my large, stable chunk of capital sat in the middle of it all, the anchor making the firm's total assets under management look impressive and legitimate. It wasn't just unethical. It wasn't just immoral. It was fraud. It had a name. It was a Ponzi scheme. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact, knocking the air from my lungs. The man my daughter had married, the father of my grandchildren, was a con artist. He had built their beautiful house, their perfect life, not on a foundation of hard work, but on a foundation of lies propped up by the life savings of people he was systematically deceiving. And the very first stone in that crooked foundation had been mine. I leaned back in my chair, the screen in front of me blurring. The betrayal was so profound, so multi-layered, it was almost elegant in its depravity. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my trust, weaponized my love for my daughter, and made me an unwitting accomplice in his crimes. The trip to Italy, the casual cruelty of that text message, it all made a new kind of sense. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the desperate need to maintain an illusion of wealth and success, an illusion that was funded by fraud. And I, with my simple, old-fashioned values, was a threat to that illusion. I was a loose thread that could unravel the whole expensive tapestry. The fight was no longer about getting my money back. It was about tearing down a house of cards before it collapsed on top of more innocent people. The discovery that my money had been used as an anchor was a heavy blow, but it didn't explain everything. It explained the lie, but it didn't explain the math. The impossibly high returns that Apex Wealth Management promised its clients still gnawed at me. An anchor can stabilize a ship, but it cannot create a favorable wind. Darian was promising his investors a hurricane-force tailwind in the middle of a dead calm. Where was the money for these supposed profits actually coming from? The public filings wouldn't show individual client transactions, but they did show aggregate capital flows. In my career, I had learned that while individual numbers can be manipulated, the overall rhythm of a company's finances is much harder to fake. A healthy business has a certain cadence, an organic and sometimes messy pattern of income and expenses, profits and losses. A fraudulent one often has a telltale signature, a rhythm that is too perfect, too clean, too good to be true. I began to map out the timing of major capital injections against the dates of scheduled dividend and profit distributions. I spent hours, maybe days, in that state of intense focus where the outside world fades away. The sun would set, and I'd only notice when the glare on my screen disappeared. My coffee would grow cold beside me. I was back in the hunt, fueled by a grim necessity. And then I saw it. It was a faint pattern at first, a whisper of a correlation. A multi-million-dollar investment would come into the firm in early March. In the first week of April, a series of large profit payments would go out to a different set of clients whose investments had been made the previous year. Another large deposit would arrive in May from a new client. In June, another round of scheduled returns would be paid out. It was a cycle, a predictable metronomic transfer of funds. The money wasn't sitting in the market growing through shrewd investments. It was barely sitting at all. It was moving, flowing from the new to the old in a continuous circular motion. My blood ran cold. My mind, trained for decades to identify and name financial structures, supplied the term with an instantaneous, brutal clarity. It was a Ponzi scheme, the classic textbook definition. Darian was not an investor. He was a thief robbing Peter to pay Paul. He was taking the principal investment from new clients, skimming his exorbitant fees off the top, and then using the remainder to pay fake profits to earlier investors to maintain the illusion of success. The entire structure, the beautiful reports, the confident projections, the luxurious office, it was all a lie. A house of cards built on greed and sustained by a constant influx of new victims. And the horror of it washed over me in waves. My son-in-law, the man I had welcomed into my home, the man who held my daughter's hand and kissed my grandchildren goodnight, was a criminal. He wasn't just arrogant or selfish. He was a predator, ruining the lives and futures of trusting people, many of them retirees like myself, who had handed him their security. The scale of the betrayal expanded until it filled every corner of my mind. The canceled vacation, the stolen house. Those were no longer personal insults. They were symptoms of a much deeper disease. They were the careless actions of a man who believed he was above consequences, a man so consumed by his own fraud that the simple decencies of family had become irrelevant. And then the final, sickening piece of the puzzle slotted into place. I realized what my role in this whole disgusting theater had been. I was not just the first victim. I was his primary tool. I was the seal of legitimacy. I could hear his smooth, reassuring voice in the ears of his other clients. My own father-in-law, a retired forensic accountant, trusts me with his entire life savings. You're in safe hands. I had been used as a reference, a character witness in a crime I didn't even know was happening. My good name, the name I had built over a lifetime of meticulous, honest work, was being used as the cornerstone of his fraudulent empire. Taking back the house was no longer the objective. It was a footnote. My mission had changed. This was no longer about recovering what was mine. It was about dismantling a machine that was designed to ruin people, and I was the only one who knew how it worked from the inside. The call came 3 days later. I was in the garden tending to Caroline's roses, the late morning sun warm on my back. For the first time in a long while I had felt a sliver of peace. Not happiness, but a quiet, clear-headed purpose. The work of untangling Darian's web of deceit was grim, but it was work I understood. It was a problem with a solution. My phone began to vibrate in my pocket, a harsh, insistent buzz against my leg. I pulled it out and saw Jessica's face on the screen. I felt no surprise, only a weary sense of inevitability. I had been waiting for this. A few days earlier, I had made a simple phone call to the bank and canceled the automatic payment for the property taxes on their house, a bill that was still ironically linked to my account. It was the first pebble tossed into the still waters of their arrogance. Now I was about to feel the ripples. I took a deep, steadying breath, wiped the soil from my hands, and answered. I didn't even get a chance to say hello. Dad, what did you do? Jessica's voice was sharp, laced with a panic that bordered on accusation. I just got an alert from the bank, a delinquency notice. It says the quarterly property tax payment was rejected. My credit score is going to be affected. Why would you do that? What are you trying to do to us? I could feel a pang of pity for her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Her primary concern, a number on a credit report, while her husband was committing federal crimes. But the pity was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of her choices. She had chosen her side. I kept my voice soft, injecting a note of tired confusion into it. Jess, honey, I'm not sure. The finances have been a little confusing lately. Her frustration crackled over the line. Confusing, Dad. It's a simple payment. You just stopped it after everything, now you're trying to ruin our credit. I heard a muffled sound, the phone being fumbled, and then Darian's voice came on the line, as smooth and cold as polished granite. Tom. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was his trick. He made his threats sound like reasonable statements of fact. I don't know what game you're playing, but let me be very clear. This is not your house. This house is in my family's name. The money was a gift, and we have a letter signed by you to prove it. You have no legal standing here whatsoever. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I remained silent, letting him fill the space. So whatever little tantrum you're throwing about Italy, he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. I suggest you end it now. Reinstate the payment. You do not want to make this a legal fight. You'll force us to spend money on lawyers' money that should be going to your grandchildren's future. And in the end, you'll lose. It's that simple. Do you understand me? In my mind, I saw him. I saw him standing in their oversized living room, chest puffed out, pacing back and forth as he delivered his lecture. He was so confident, so sure of his position. He was brandishing a tiny legal shield, a simple gift letter, completely oblivious to the sword hanging over his head. He thought this was a battle over property law, a battle he was certain he could win. He had no idea I was fighting on an entirely different battlefield, one where the rules were written by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the penalties were far more severe than losing a house. His arrogance was a gift. It was the critical flaw, the crack in his armor, that would allow me to bring the entire rotten structure down. He saw a sad old man, emotional and irrational. He was blind to the forensic accountant who was at that very moment calculating the precise trajectory of his downfall. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the echo of Darian's threat. His confidence was a tangible thing, a wall of arrogance built brick by brick. I let the silence stretch a long, calculated pause. In my mind, I was an actor stepping onto a stage, taking a moment to find my character. The character was a man named Tom Shelby, but a version of him they had invented, a lonely, sentimental old fool, easily frightened and desperate for his family's affection. I took a deep breath, and when I spoke, I let a slight tremor enter my voice. I let out a long, weary sigh, the kind of sound a man makes when he knows he is utterly defeated. "You're right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're right, Darian." I let another pause hang in the air, then continued, making sure my words sounded broken, apologetic. "I'm sorry. I truly am. I haven't been thinking clearly since Carolyn passed. The house is so quiet. Sometimes I don't know what I'm doing." I was laying the foundation of my performance brick by pathetic brick. When Jessica told me about Italy, I went on, my voice cracking slightly. I just pictured her. I pictured Caroline. She always wanted to go, and I just felt so left out. It was a stupid, childish thing to do, stopping that payment. A terrible, selfish thing. I know you're building a future for my grandchildren, and I put that at risk over my own foolish feelings. I am so sorry. As I spoke, I could almost feel Darian on the other end of the line, puffing up his chest, exchanging a triumphant glance with my daughter. His victory was so easy. The old man had folded just as he knew he would. I could hear a muffled whisper, and then Jessica's voice came back on, softer now, laced with relief. "Oh, Daddy, it's okay. We were just so worried. We understand you're lonely." The condescension in her voice was a sharp sting, but I embraced it. It was fuel. I was no longer her father. I was a problem that had been successfully managed. Now it was time to set the bait. "Please," I said, my voice pleading. "I don't want to fight. The thought of lawyers, it's too much. I don't want this between us. Can we please just meet? We can fix this. I want to fix this." I paused, as if gathering my courage for the final, complete surrender. "I will sign whatever papers are necessary. We can go to the bank, have it all notarized, whatever you need. I will sign to transfer the house to you completely, no more strings attached, no more attachments to my accounts. I just want us to be a family again. I want to do this the right way so there are no more misunderstandings." The hook was in the water. The phrase "the right way" was the perfect lure. It spoke to their desire for legal and financial finality. The shift in Darian's tone was immediate and profound. The cold, threatening professional was gone, replaced by a magnanimous victor. "Of course, Tom," he said, his voice now oozing with a sickening, patronizing warmth. "Of course. That's all we ever wanted. For things to be clear and simple. We knew you'd see reason." I could hear the smile in his voice. He had won. He had wrestled the unruly old man into submission and secured his prize. "Why don't we meet at my office?" he suggested. "No," I said a little too quickly, then softened my voice again. "No, if you don't mind. Your office feels a little intimidating. Could we maybe meet at the main branch of my bank downtown? In one of their conference rooms, it just feels more neutral, more official. It would make me feel more comfortable knowing it's all being handled properly." Darian chuckled, a sound of pure satisfaction. "Whatever makes you comfortable, Tom. The bank is fine. How about Friday at 10 a.m.? "Friday at 10 is perfect," I said softly. "Thank you, Darian. Thank you, Jess. This means the world to me." We said our goodbyes, their voices full of false cheer and my own full of feigned gratitude. I ended the call and placed the phone back on my desk. My hand was not shaking. My heart was not racing. It was beating with a slow, steady, and cold rhythm. The performance was over, and they had given me a standing ovation. Now it was time to prepare the stage for the final act. The 2 days leading up to the Friday meeting were a blur of quiet, intense activity. My home was no longer a place of grief. It had become a command center. The grief was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was now surrounded by the scaffolding of purpose. Ben and I worked out of his office, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and the low hum of the printer. Our preparation was twofold, a strategy with two distinct fronts. The first was the civil matter of the house. Ben drew up the legal documents with the precision of a surgeon. A formal notice of default on our private loan agreement, a demand for immediate repayment, and failing that the legal filings necessary to place a lien on the property and force a sale. This was our leverage. This was the part of the trap that Darian could see, the part he thought he could fight. The second front was the one Darian couldn't see. It was the criminal matter, the dark, sprawling reality of the Ponzi scheme. This was the part that made my hands tremble when I reached for my coffee cup. Ben, ever the cautious professional, sat me down on the second day. He leaned back in his creaking leather chair and fixed me with a serious gaze. "Tom," he said, his voice low, "I need you to be absolutely certain. Once I make a call to my contact at the SEC, this is no longer your story. It becomes their investigation. It stops being a family matter and becomes a federal case. Jessica, your daughter, she will be caught in the firestorm. Her life as she knows it will be destroyed. There is no going back from this." I looked out at his window at the busy street below, at people living their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the webs of deceit that can be woven around them. I thought of the other investors, the other families whose security was being drained away to fund my daughter's lifestyle. I thought of Caroline, of the integrity she had lived by every single day of her life. My duty was no longer simply to my daughter. My daughter had made her choice. My duty now was to the truth. "She is already in this firestorm, Ben," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "She just doesn't know her house is already on fire. Make the call." I watched as Ben picked up the phone. He didn't dial a public hotline. He dialed a direct number, a contact he had known for years. I didn't listen to every word, but I heard the tone. It was calm, professional, and chillingly precise. "John, it's Ben Carter. I have a client, a retired forensic accountant with an impeccable record, who has uncovered some significant and deeply troubling irregularities in a local wealth management firm. Yes, Apex. The evidence is preliminary, but it points to a classic Ponzi structure. My client is willing to cooperate fully?" It was done. A machine vast and powerful had just been set in motion. With the legal pieces moving in the background, I focused on the logistics of the meeting itself. Darian's office was out of the question. That was his territory, his stage. I needed a place that was neutral, a place where he held no power. I needed a place where the language of numbers and rules held more weight than the language of charisma and lies. A bank. I chose the main downtown branch of my own bank, a grand old building with marble floors and soaring ceilings that always made you feel a little smaller, a little more accountable. I called and reserved their largest conference room, a space with a long, dark wood table and a sense of solemn, quiet authority. It was the perfect stage for the final act. My last step was the final lure. I called Darian the afternoon before the meeting to confirm our appointment. I made my voice sound hesitant, a little nervous, the voice of a man having second thoughts. After confirming the time and place, I paused and then said, "Darian, there's just one more thing. Since this meeting is to, finalize everything, Ben advised me that for my own peace of mind, I should probably have a look at the overall health of the firm my investment has been sitting in all this time. Could you bring the latest performance reports for Apex? And maybe the prospectus you show to new clients? Just the high-level stuff. I want to walk away from this meeting feeling good about everything, Feeling like my original investment helped you build something solid before I sign it all away." There was a brief silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Was this a trick? But his own arrogance quickly supplied the answer he wanted to hear. The old man was scared and he needed one last bit of reassurance. Better yet, this was an opportunity. This was his chance to rub my face in his success, to prove how brilliant he was right before I signed away my last shred of control. He might even be able to talk me into leaving some of the money with him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was slick with false empathy. Tom, that is a fantastic idea. A very prudent request. Of course. I'll bring everything. I want you to be completely comfortable. I'm proud of what we're building at Apex, and I'd be happy to walk you through it. The condescension was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife. Thank you, Darian, I said softly. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up the phone. Every piece was in its place. The hunter, the bait, the authorities waiting in the wings. The trap was set. It was perfect. The conference room was cold. It wasn't just the air conditioning which hummed a low, monotonous tune. It was the room itself. The long, dark table was polished to a mirror finish reflecting the sterile fluorescent lights above. The high-backed leather chairs felt less like furniture and more like thrones for a corporate tribunal. It was a place designed for stripping away emotion, for reducing everything to profit and loss, risk and liability. It was the perfect venue. Ben and I were seated and waiting when they arrived. We had been silent for 10 minutes, two still figures in a sea of corporate stillness. Then the heavy door swung open and they walked in, bringing with them a gust of nervous energy and misplaced confidence. Jessica was dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking suit, a brittle smile plastered on her face. Darian strode in front of her, carrying a thick, gleaming leather briefcase. He looked every bit the master of the universe, the victorious son-in-law, coming to accept the final surrender of the defeated old man. He placed his briefcase on the table with a loud, assertive thud, a sound meant to declare his importance. "Okay, Tom," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He didn't even look at Ben. He looked only at me. "Let's get this over with. We have a vacation to pack for." I did not answer him with words. Instead, I reached for the simple, thin manila folder that sat in front of me. With a slow, deliberate movement, I pushed it across the vast, polished surface of the table. It slid silently, a tiny raft on a dark ocean coming to a stop directly in front of him. It was a stark contrast to his own bulging briefcase, and the visual metaphor was not lost on him. He eyed it with suspicion. "First things first," I said, my voice even. "About the house." Before Darian could retort, Ben Carter spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the sharp, clean edge of tempered steel. It was the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime wielding facts as weapons. "Mr. Darian," Ben began, his eyes locked on my son-in-law. "My client, Mr. Shelby, has asked me to clarify the legal standing of the $285,000 he transferred to your firm's account last year." Darian waved a dismissive hand. "It was a gift. We have a letter. This is a waste of time." Ben did not flinch. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the nature of the transaction." He continued, his tone unchanging. "The funds were not a gift. They were structured as a zero-interest revocable loan secured by the property at 125 Elm Street. The primary condition of this loan was an unspoken but legally binding good-faith agreement of familial harmony and mutual respect." A flicker of confusion crossed Darian's face. Jessica's smile began to tremble at the edges. Ben pressed on, his voice relentless. "Your recent actions, specifically, the decision to unilaterally exclude Mr. Shelby from a significant family event, an event he was led to believe he was a part of, constitutes a material breach of that good-faith agreement." He paused, letting the words sink into the cold air. "Therefore," he concluded, "as of 9 a.m. this morning, Mr. Shelby has exercised his legal right to recall the loan in its entirety. The full amount is now due. Since we do not expect you to have the liquid capital to cover it, we have already initiated the legal process. The house will be listed for sale this Monday. According to the terms of the agreement you signed, when you accepted the funds, you have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Jessica's face completely crumbled. The color drained away, leaving behind a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Darian stared at Ben, his mind racing, trying to process the information. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure, arrogant disbelief. "You're bluffing," he scoffed. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. A familial harmony clause, no court in the world would enforce that." He leaned forward, his bravado returning, fueled by anger. "We have a gift letter signed. It's ironclad. You can't do this. We'll sue you. We'll sue you for everything you have." I looked at him, at his face flushed with rage, his finger pointing at my old friend. And I felt nothing but a profound, grim pity. He was still fighting the battle he thought he was here to win. He had no idea he had already lost the war. Darian's threat to sue hung in the cold air of the conference room, a final desperate roar from a cornered animal. I met his furious gaze not with anger, but with a quiet, profound stillness. The emotional storm inside me had long since passed. All that remained was a grim, unshakable calm. I looked at this man who had so thoroughly dismantled my family, who had built his kingdom on lies, and I felt a deep and sorrowful pity. "I don't think you will," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to carry more weight than all his blustering. As the words left my lips, there was a soft, polite knock on the conference room door. It was a sound so gentle, yet so final, it seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen from the room. Before anyone could speak, the door opened. A man and a woman in dark conservative business suits stepped inside. They moved with an air of quiet, unimpeachable authority. They were not police officers. They were something far more terrifying to a man like Darian. The woman stepped forward. She was sharp, intelligent, her eyes missing nothing. She held up a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal official credentials. "Daniela Rossi," she said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is my colleague, Mr. Fields." She looked directly at Darian, her gaze analytical and completely devoid of emotion. "Mr. Darian, we have a few questions for you regarding the business practices of Apex Wealth Management." It was the O moment. The moment the world pivots on its axis, and everything you thought was true is revealed to be a lie. The change in Darian was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if his strings had been cut. The rage, the arrogance, the self-righteous indignation. It all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of pure, cold terror. The flush of anger on his face was replaced by a deathly, waxy pallor. His mouth hung slightly open. His body, which had been leaning forward in a posture of aggression, seemed to shrink into his expensive suit. He was no longer a predator. He was simply prey. Ben Carter took this as his cue. He opened the thick file in front of him, the one filled with the long, meticulous hours of my life's work. He did not address Darian. He spoke directly to Agent Rossi, but every word was a hammer blow aimed at my son-in-law. "Agent Rossi," Ben began, his voice a steady legal drone, "we believe you'll find a number of significant irregularities. Exhibit A, the initial wire transfer of $285,000 from my client, Mr. Shelby. You will note it was routed not to an escrow account for a real estate transaction, but directly into Apex's primary operating fund, where it was immediately leveraged as firm capital." He slid a document across the table. Darian flinched, as if it were a white-hot piece of steel. "Furthermore," Ben continued, gesturing to the proud stack of papers Darian had brought with him. "Exhibit B, the very performance reports Mr. Darian was kind enough to bring today. When cross-referenced with actual market data, a simple analysis prepared by Mr. Shelby shows a performance discrepancy of over 40%. The returns are, in a word, fictitious." I watched my daughter Jessica. Her eyes were wide, darting from Ben's calm face to the SEC agent's impassive one to her husband's frozen, terrified expression. The beautiful, intricate lie that was her life was being dismantled piece by painful piece right in front of her. She was beginning to understand. Ben was not finished. And finally, Exhibit C, a comprehensive flow of funds analysis. It demonstrates a clear and undeniable pattern of new investor capital being used to pay dividends and returns to existing investors. We've also taken the liberty of tracing several recent withdrawals for personal expenses. Ben paused and looked at Jessica for the first time, a flicker of pity in his eyes. This includes 2 first-class tickets to Rome and a 5-star villa rental in Tuscany paid for from an account funded last month by the entire retirement savings of a retired school teacher from Ohio. That was it. That was the final blow. Jessica let out a small, strangled sob. The sound was not of anger, but of utter devastation. Her perfect vacation, the one she had excluded her own father from, was funded by the ruin of another family. Her beautiful house, her designer clothes, her entire identity, it was all a fraud. Darian sat perfectly still, a statue carved from fear. He was broken. There was no fight left in him, no lies, no smooth excuses, only the stark, barren truth of his own criminality. Agent Rossi closed her small notebook. "Mr. Darian," she said, her professional tone unchanged, "we'd like you to accompany us downtown to answer some further questions." It was not a request. It was a verdict. Darian rose from his chair like a man in a trance. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his weeping wife. He simply allowed himself to be escorted from the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound I had ever heard. The air in the room was thick with the wreckage of a life. Darian was a statue, a hollow man in an expensive suit, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room, a future that had just been utterly and completely erased. But my eyes were on my daughter, Jessica. She sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. The silent tears that had been streaming down her face had stopped. Her expression was no longer one of simple shock or grief. It was something deeper, something far more terrible. It was the look of absolute soul-crushing comprehension. Her gaze lifted from her husband's vacant face and slowly, inevitably moved to meet mine. In that moment, I saw the entire story play out in her eyes. It was like watching a film in fast forward. She saw the text message she had sent, the casual cruelty of those 2 words, family only. She saw my hurt, a thing she had dismissed as the petty grievance of a lonely old man. And then she saw the direct, unbreakable line connecting that small act of betrayal to this catastrophic end. She finally understood. Her husband was a criminal, yes, but she had been the one to light the fuse. Her desire for a life of curated perfection, her willingness to push me aside to please her ambitious husband, her own casual disregard for the man who had given her everything that was the key that had unlocked this room of judgment. She saw that her own actions had initiated the audit of her life, and the audit had found nothing but fraud. I had not done this to her. She had done this to herself. I offered no words of comfort, no gesture of reconciliation. There are some chasms so deep that you cannot reach across them, and we were standing on opposite sides of a canyon she had spent years digging. Agent Rossi finally closed her notebook with a soft click. The sound seemed to startle Darian from his trance. "Mr. Darian," she said, her voice polite but firm, "it's time to go. Please." There was no struggle. There were no last-minute protests, no desperate pleas. All the fight had drained out of him, leaving behind an empty vessel. He rose from his chair with a slow, mechanical stiffness, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He did not look at Jessica. He did not look at me. He simply walked toward the door, flanked by the 2 agents, a man already living in the ghost of his own life. The heavy door opened, he walked through, and it clicked shut behind him. The sound was deafening in its finality. And then there was only silence. A profound and devastating silence filled only by the sound of my daughter's quiet, broken sobs. Her American dream, the one built on shiny surfaces and stolen futures, had not just vanished. It had melted away under the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth, leaving nothing behind but the ugly, sticky residue of the lie. I did not stay to watch the full collapse. I left the bank that day with Ben, leaving my daughter to sit alone in the wreckage of the life she had chosen. There is no satisfaction in watching someone's world burn to the ground, even when you are the one who lit the match. There is only the grim, quiet finality of a necessary act. In the months that followed, the story played out in the business section of the newspapers. Headlines spoke of the Apex wealth management scandal, of a promising young financial star who had built an empire on sand. I read the articles not with triumph, but with a detached sense of confirmation, like an auditor reviewing a final report. The house, the beautiful house that had been the stage for so much pain, was sold. When the funds were finally cleared and the original $285,000 plus interest was returned to my account, I did not keep a single dollar of it. Instead, I established the Caroline Shelby Foundation for Financial Integrity. It was not a grand, headline-grabbing charity. It was a small local trust with a simple, clear purpose to provide free workshops and personal counseling on financial literacy for senior citizens. It was a foundation designed to teach others how to spot the Darians of the world, how to read the fine print, how to protect the foundations of their own lives from the smooth talkers and the smiling predators. One afternoon, a long, handwritten letter arrived. It was from Jessica. It was filled with words of remorse and regret, words I had once longed to hear. I read it, and I put it away in a drawer. I did not reply. A bridge so thoroughly burned cannot be rebuilt in a day or with a single letter. If we were ever to have a relationship again, it would have to be a new one built from the ground up on a new foundation of honesty and respect. That is a slow and quiet work, and I do not know if we have the time or the will to complete it. The story ends here. But my life did not. This morning I stood in a bright, clean room at the local community center. In front of me were 24 attentive faces, men and women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were here to learn to protect themselves. I was at the whiteboard explaining the difference between a compound interest chart and the impossible hockey stick curve of a Ponzi scheme's returns. And as I spoke, I felt a sense of peace I had not felt in years. I had not just reclaimed my own dignity. I had found a purpose that was larger than my own pain. I was helping others guard their own. I was protecting other families, other legacies. This, I realized, was the true foundation Carolyn and I had always meant to build. One not made of money or property, but of wisdom, integrity, and the simple, powerful act of looking out for one another. This painful chapter taught me that a foundation built only on money is no foundation at all. It is merely a transaction waiting to fail. For years, I confused financial support with love, allowing my own dignity to be quietly eroded in the name of keeping the peace. I learned that true family is built upon the much stronger pillars of mutual respect and unwavering honesty. Sometimes the most loving act is not to give more, but to demand respect for what has already been given. The cost of that lesson was immense, but the peace that comes from restoring order is priceless. If this story of quiet strength resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below.